Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This afternoon, we're going to be talking with Nikolas Gvosdev, who is the editor of Orbis, FPRI's scholarly journal on world affairs. And he's going to be speaking with Dr. Rabia Zafar, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the U.S. Naval War College. They're going to be talking about an article that was in the spring edition of Orbis, and here's a picture of it. You can see I also have to put in a plug for Orbis because Orbis, for the first time in its history, and it was started in the 50s, has a full color cover. We think it looks great, but it's, the innards of Orbis are what really count, but the cover's beautiful too. Just want to point that out so it will look pretty on your coffee tables. Nick Gvosdev, whom many of you know, in addition to being editor of Orbis, is also a senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program. He's a professor of national security affairs in economic geography and national security at the U.S. Naval War College. Today's event, as I mentioned, Dr. Rabia Zafar will be talking about her article, which looks at the rising extremist violence around the world and the conditions that are giving rise to that in many parts of the world. I'd also like to have you put in a plug for some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow morning from 10 to 11 a.m., FPRI's Chris Miller, the Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of Estonia, Marko Koplima, Marko Koplima will be talking about the 3 C's initiative and how it fits into U.S. foreign policy. Oops, I missed one person. It was Eastern European Study Center's Linus Kojala will also be part of that discussion. If you're not familiar with the 3 C's initiative, tomorrow morning will be a good opportunity to find out all about it. Friday, May 14th from 10 to 11 a.m. We're going to be having an event hosted by FPRI's Aaron Stein and the authors. He's going to be talking with the authors of FPRI's latest Black Sea strategy paper. And this paper looks at Russian-Turkish relations and their implications for the West. The authors of that paper are Robert Hamilton, whom many of you know. He's a long time senior fellow with our Eurasia program, and Anna Mikulska. We'll talk about the major takeaways from that report. For today's event, I'm sure many of you will have questions. We hope you'll have some questions you'll want to put in our Q&A box. Put them in the Q&A. We'll be sure to see them. The chat, on the other hand, we will be sending you some maps of the regions that are discussed. Chat is also a good place. If you have a question about the technology, having trouble, put that there. And finally, before I turn it over to Nick, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for your support of FPRI. We can't do it without you. For those of you who are on the call because you want to learn more but aren't yet members or supporters, if you value what we do for you, please consider supporting us. This is way, way cheaper than any of your subscriptions to cable news networks, and I would venture to say you get a lot more out of this. So please support us. Nick, take it away.
Thank you, Raleigh. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm glad so many of you have been able to join us for what will be a fascinating discussion for this hour. I'm really happy to welcome my colleague, Dr. Rabia Zafar, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow with me in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College, completed her doctoral work in 2019 at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, but before that was a practitioner and in the field, serving as a intelligence officer at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, having on the ground experience and observation in various parts of the world, notably in Central and South Asia, where we see some of these issues continue to rise. I'm very pleased as well that we're discussing the topic of her article on entrepreneurial extremism, which is paving the way for a book that will eventually be coming out on this topic as well. And it's just such an interesting frame. We've become very used to thinking about extremism in terms of deep held beliefs, ideologies, mental states of people, and to sit back and say, what about the entrepreneurial side? How does preparing and engaging in violence fit in to social structures? How can it be a source for generating benefits for some of the perpetrators? How does it play into economic and social life of the communities in which extremist movements develop? Uh, it gives us a different way and a different frame of looking at this. So certainly I hope that when you got the invitation, you're able to follow the link to the article and to get a sense of the concept and how it is playing out in Pakistan, on which the article is focused. But also to give Rabia a chance to discuss this. And so I'll turn the floor over to her. Lay out the concept for us, the key takeaways, things you think people ought to be taking from this concept, why it's important. And again, having come across the work and really saying this is something I thought that was important for Orbis readers because it's a fresh look at a perennial issue of dealing with violent extremism. So turning it over to you, take us away.
Thank you so much, Nick, for the introduction and for also raising some really important questions and points that I hope to get to in our discussion today. I also wanted to thank Raleigh and the Foreign Policy Research Institute for giving me this opportunity to share some of my ideas and my research. And of course, to the audience for taking the time and having the interest. I'm most excited to get to your questions in the later half of this hour. So I am going to spend a bit of time outlining the concept of enterprising extremists, as Nick said, elaborating on my article and going through some of the insights from my empirical work in Pakistan. But I'd also like to take kind of a look at the practical implications of this concept of enterprising extremists, right? What does this framework tell us about future trends in violence? Whether in Pakistan or beyond, how might enterprising extremists operate in other contexts outside of Pakistan? And what are some policy implications of this research, right? What does it tell us about combating extremist violence in general? But first, I'd like to start with a bit of a personal story that may help give a little perspective and color to the work and some of the concepts that we'll talk about. So the story begins back in 2005 when there was a major earthquake in northeastern part of Pakistan. I was working here in Boston and had applied to graduate programs and was waiting to hear back. So I decided to leave my job a little early and see if I could go and take part in the post-earthquake relief effort. And I ended up working on the outskirts of Islamabad at a kind of a camp for displaced people from the earthquake. I mean, it was a huge sprawling camp, which was divided into multiple blocks, and each block was run by either a government agency or an NGO or a charity. And I ended up working in a block that was run by the Turkish Red Crescent Society, and it was very well funded. It had functioning latrines and waterproof tents and all of that. But a few rows down from us was a block that was in complete squalor, right? So what you would imagine kind of a refugee camp to look like, a very stereotypical kind. And it was unclear to me who was running that camp. Sometimes it seemed that it was a charity. Perhaps one time I saw the black flag, which was associated with the Taliban at the time, flying overhead. Some people said it was a criminal group that was funding it. But what's most curious to me was that this block was oversubscribed. People actually wanted to live there. People from my block wanted to move there if they could. And when I, asked around as to why that might be, I got, the answer that, well, it's a religious kind of camp. They maintain religious norms and codes, and they offer Quranic learning to children. They offer a copy of the Quran. And that answer kind of affirmed much of what I thought I understood at the time about extremist recruiting, about the emotive power of religion, about the vulnerability of at-risk populations. Like Nick said, I was a former intelligence officer, and I had produced analysis that rested on some of these assumptions. So it affirmed my worldview, and I accepted it. Towards the end of my time at the camp, I learned actually that that block was paying its residents to live there. So it was handing out about 500 rupees per resident, which at the time was about $6. And so I've spent a lot of time sort of trying to unpack this experience and draw lessons from it, what it means, what it tells us about extremism, extremist violence, what it tells us about, at-risk populations. And in many ways, this experience informed my academic inquiry. It helped me identify the problem or the puzzle that became the basis of this research, which I'm going to present to you today. And that problem specifically is that extremist violence, its causes, its main actors, and its potential remedies are not well understood, right? Even now, despite 2 decades of war in the name of combating extremism or terrorism or whatever label you want to put on it, and importantly, despite consistent tactical success on the part of the United States military, we can't by any stretch of the imagination say that the war against extremism or the war against terrorism has been won, right? If anything, recent indicators like the Taliban's political comeback, the formation of new extremist groups with huge political clout, like the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, TLP, for those of us who follow Pakistan, those type of groups coming, coming about and actually gaining a lot of support. The ongoing crisis of Syrian refugees, and the rise of religious nationalism and populist movements in places like India and Turkey, right, that were once hubs of secular politics. All these indicate that incentives and opportunities for extremist violence are on the rise, right? Whether or not we can say that, however we measure extremist violence, if the violence itself is on the rise or not, that's an empirical question. But at least the incentives and opportunities based on these indicators are there for that rise to occur in the near future. And this is all happening at a time when the United States and the world at large has other priorities, right? So the US, China, Russia engaged in rivalry, great power competition, right? The mammoth task of post-pandemic recovery. And some places of the world who can't even start thinking about recovery, like India and Brazil right now, they're in the thick of it, right? Climate crisis reaching a tipping point in many parts of the world. But so given all these problem sets, extremist violence isn't being discussed in Washington or other major capitals the way it used to be. But what I want to advocate for you here today is that it should be. There's a need to revive thinking on extremist violence, its causes, its consequences, its remedies, and to capture the lessons learned from 2 decades of trying to deal with this problem set, whether it's through military means, the State Department, policy, aid, development work. We need to start capturing some of those lessons learned. And I believe that because of that, extremist violence should be part of our current global threat assessment. It can be found intersecting with each of the threats that I just named before. We can't think of these problem sets in isolation from one another. They impact and influence each other. There's an intersectionality that needs to be considered. So as such, I argue that we need to develop new conceptual and policy frameworks that are rooted in empirical realities, rather than based on normative assumptions about religion or particular ideologies. Religion, as I contend in the article, and I'll say it here again, is analytically unhelpful as a lens by which to study extremist violence or to set policy to counter it. And that might be somewhat controversial or even counterintuitive, but it becomes very clear when we lower the analysis from the national to the subnational level, as I did in the case of Pakistan. So what I did was collected data on incidents of extremist violence from 4 different cities. on a long time period from 1988 to 2016. And what I found was a great deal of variation in incidents of extremist violence, right? So I found that spikes and lulls in extremist violence occur at different times in different places. And this is curious, this is puzzling if we assume ideology to be the main driver of extremist violence. Because evidence of violent religious ideology, however you want to measure that, whatever proxy variables you want to use, whether it's the presence of militant extremist groups or religious schools or seminary that espouse extremist curricula, or Friday sermons that are espousing violence or promoting violence, that you can find within this time period and across these cities consistently. But this ideology doesn't consistently result or produce extremist violence, incidents of extremist violence, right? So as I've argued in the article, Pakistan's insecurity is not explained well by religion. Rather, it's better explained by this constant hedging of what I call violent entrepreneurs as they strategically substitute one form of violence for another. This special group of actors can style and restyle their violence in the various narratives of religious extremism, ethno-nationalism, electoral politics, or even mafiaism, straight up, kind of organized crime gangs. And these actors are motivated by their desire for affluence and influence, right? Profit and kind of a seat at the table, making decisions. And they have the means and ability to calculate costs and benefits and change course according to the opportunity structures around them. So it's a strategic choice what type of violence that they pursue, whether they choose to pursue criminal gang violence or frame their violence in the language, in the narrative of extremism. That's a strategic choice based on rational calculations, is what I'm arguing. And this is much like traditional entrepreneurs, right? That can, they can read the market and they can make decisions to maximize their efficiency. And to be clear, I'm talking about a very rarefied group of actors. These violent entrepreneurs are the leaders, the decision makers who determine trends in violence, not the rank and file member. And I'm also not talking about people who might, become radicalized or turn to violence. I'm talking about people who will always be engaged in some form of violent activity and set the trends, but they're not peaceful people who then turn to extremism. They're the leaders of extremist violent groups. So like I said, you'll see the same type of actors sometimes engaging in the drug trade, sometimes engaging in electoral politics, and then for our purposes, sometimes engaging in extremist violence. And when these violent entrepreneurs, in the moments that they do engage in extremist violence, that's when I refer to them as enterprising extremists. I spent some time in the article talking about ways to identify extremist violence from this complicated mix of collective violence, and if these actors are fungible, if they're sometimes drug lords and sometimes extremists, how can we pull out extremist violence from this messy mix? And I'm happy to talk through some of those methodological issues in the Q&A if there's interest. But here I want to discuss why violent entrepreneurs might choose why might they choose extremist violence as opposed to another violent strategy? So what drives these violent entrepreneurs to become enterprising extremists? And in Pakistan, I find 3 conditions that incentivize extremist violence. The first is state endorsement of extremist violence, whether this is done tacitly or overtly. When the state is somehow signaling that extremist violence is okay, the incentives will rise, right? And this endorsement can come in many forms, from selective policing, which turns a blind eye to certain types of violence, to more direct training, arming, and funding extremist groups. For violent entrepreneurs, state endorsement lowers the cost of engaging in violence, in extremist violence, relative to other forms of violence, right? So when extremists face a lower risk of being captured or having their activities disrupted by law enforcement, violent entrepreneurs will reposition themselves. Violent entrepreneurs of all stripes will reposition themselves as enterprising extremists. And state endorsement not only reduces the most serious risks of engaging in extremist violence, but it also heightens the rewards in some cases, right? When the state is offering support and legitimacy to extremists in the form of access to arms, training, funding, or simply a seat at the table, as we're finding right now with the TLP, which I mentioned in Pakistan, when they're getting a political say, not through elections, but perhaps through being able to incite large protests and kind of dictate terms to the government. When that happens, clearly the incentives for extremist violence as opposed to some other forms of violence are heightened. The second condition that I find in Pakistan which incentivizes extremist violence is market structure. And by that I mean two specific compositions in the marketplace of violence. And this term or this concept that there is a marketplace, a bazaar of violence is something that exists in literature. And we can speak to that a little more. But the conditions that I find that I think incentivize violence is when there's a market structure, when there is ongoing competition between similarly matched violent actors in this marketplace, in this bazaar of violence. Or the second condition is when there's almost a monopoly, a near monopoly, where the top violent actor is engaging predominantly in extremist violence. So in the first case, these similarly matched actors will try to outbid one another, whether through violent outbidding, more and more extreme forms of violence, or a process of religious outbidding where to have the largest appeal, to cross different types of affinity groups, they will become or use the narratives or the propaganda of extremism, of religious extremism, to appeal to the broadest base possible. In the second case, this near monopoly, this we can think of as kind of bandwagoning with the most powerful actor. And this we've seen quite a bit in Pakistan. So, there's one actor like the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, right, the TTP, that gained notoriety, became, a force to contend with. In places like Swat in about 2010, kind of taking over, having a monopoly of violence, having a monopoly of kind of all criminal activity. So what we found there was that smaller groups or thugs or criminal gangs either left, or even different factions of the Taliban either just left the area, kind of retreated, conceded that space, or they tried to join or emulate these actors, right? So they used the brand cachet of the Taliban, the brand recognition. So if you're going to hold someone up for ransom, saying that you're Taliban rather than you're Joe from the street was a lot more effective. And so that's what they did. And finally, the third condition I've identified that incentivizes extremist violence is patronage, or more precisely, when traditional patronage networks start to falter, right? And longstanding patrons are no longer to reliably offer patronage, or reliably offer services, access. And these traditional patrons are not only tribal elites and feudal elites, but they're also politicians, bureaucrats, and other official actors when they're acting in their unofficial capacities, which happens quite a bit. And Pakistan, like many post-colonial states, have this long history of patronage-based service provision, which we can go into if you like in the Q&A. And they provide an important service. They provide important services in lieu of formalized state services or lack of access to those state services. So when those networks are disrupted, I argue that it gives an in for violent entrepreneurs to turn to extremist violence. And these disruptions happen for a number of reasons, from political reshuffling, huge demographic shifts that change the established rules of the game, structural changes. So, when there's a devolution of powers, for example, from the federal to the provincial or local level. So these kind of sources of patronage are controlled by different actors. Or sometimes it's just a drying up of sources of patronage, right? So, for example, the NATO supply chain, which transited from the port in Karachi overland to Afghanistan, was a huge source of patronage. kickbacks, safe passage, sometimes kind of the smuggling of certain containers, right? So when that dries up, there's this reshuffling. And in that reshuffle, I argue that these violent actors that are kind of positioned as extremist actors have an edge. They have an organizational advantage because unlike secular political parties, they tend to be given a lot more leeway to organize. We see this in Egypt, for example, with the Muslim Brotherhood. So, you know, they're allowed the space to actually organize, to work, because they're not necessarily a political threat to incumbent governments. And the same has been true for religious parties in Pakistan. They act as kingmakers. They can, you know, like I said, incite protests, quell protests, but largely not a direct challenge to local government in the way that secular parties might be. So they're given that space to organize. And so violent entrepreneurs take advantage of that space. And this allows them access to both resources and potential clients, right? Positioning themselves as religious actors gives them the broadest possible appeal. Religious extremist narratives can cut across all types of social cleavages, affinity groups. So these are the three conditions, I believe, that interact with each other to produce opportunity structures that incentivize extremist violence in Pakistan. But these are the conditions I found in Pakistan. It's not to say that this will be the same set of conditions elsewhere. But I do believe that enterprising extremists are not a Pakistan-specific phenomenon. I think this framework is broadly applicable, and there are broader implications of the research, right? I think that enterprising extremists exist all over the world, including the United States. And these rational actors take advantage of local conditions or of the political or social climate of the time to capitalize on extremist, divisive narratives. Like I said, I don't believe that religion or political ideology even is what's driving this behavior, right? And we saw this in Syria and Iraq. You had secular Ba'athist players, part of the government, then are now members of ISIS, right? And they had a system of taxation. They had a governance system running. This was not, ideologically motivated, looking for the caliphate type people. These were people who had worked in bureaucracy. They knew how to set up a system of taxation. They knew how to issue parking tickets, right? So it was a different set of people who were involved in that. All this to say, I think this is good news when it comes to policy, right? Because incentives, unlike hearts and minds, are much more malleable. And what I mean to say by that is that we being, the United States has spent a lot of time on messaging, on educational programs, on kind of trying to disseminate different cultural norms of democracy, in the hopes that it will affect a positive change in extremist violence, right? I'm not saying that these initiatives are not a good thing to do for other reasons. What I am suggesting is that the impact of these initiatives on extremist violence, on the occurrence of extremist violence, is unclear. That causal relationship between these programs and a reduction of extremist violence is unclear, and I believe that this is not the right path, right? So affecting hearts and minds is not the way to go about it. I think that policy should be more focused on influencing these very worldly incentives, right? So the United States has the ability to influence these incentives, and local governments obviously do as well. But the first step, I argue, is to identify the incentive structure in which violent entrepreneurs operate, right? So I've tried to do that here for Pakistan. I've laid out the conditions. But what I'm saying is that these conditions will be different in different parts of the world, right? And so this requires very context-specific local knowledge and expertise. So that's my first soapbox type plug, right? So this need for regional or even country level research, country level expertise is important, right? While understanding obviously the global context, but to know what the incentive structures are locally, you need to have a very localized understanding of the country or the region. And then the next step is to find ways to influence those incentive structures, right? So for the example of Pakistan, the conditions that I laid out, you can already, I'm sure the audience is already thinking of many ways that those incentive structures could be influenced, right? So one example, you know, when I talk about state endorsement of violent activities, why would the Pakistani state want to endorse extremism, right? And we can look back at the history for those of us who study Pakistan of when particular points in time in history was strategically conducive to doing so. You know, the Cold War incentives, when the Iranian Revolution and trying to stand as a bulwark to that, right? And how can the U.S. step in? Well, first of all, the U.S. can change its relationship on how it deals with military versus civilian counterparts, right? Because when the Pakistan's policy is so military dominated, if the military has this outsized role in setting policy, then many of the frames that are going to be used from a security perspective, right? So when our Secretary of Defense meets with his counterpart, that counterpart is not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff equivalent, right? It should not be a military person. It should be the Minister of Defense, right? Policy should not be discussed. It should be handled by the State Department. So those are the kind of impacts that the United States can have. Or when we think about new funding streams, I mentioned the NATO supply chain, kind of thinking through what that means. What are those points of access? How can those funding streams be controlled? For Pakistan itself, thinking about ways to formalize service provision, right? Especially in these huge urban contexts, how to formalize. It's not that there's, you know, we often, when we talk about Pakistan and other similar states, we talk about them in the context of lack of state capacity. I argue it's not lack of state capacity, it's harnessing the state capacity to serve the citizens, right? So finding ways to do that. Because we see bureaucrats that offer state services in a private capacity. So the services exist, right? So trash collectors will work for private industry in their government uniforms, using their government funds, right? So kind of finding ways to formalize that. And we can think that those are just examples, but what I'm trying to suggest here that there are ways to influence incentive structures that are more practical, they're more tangible than trying to affect and change hearts and minds, which may or may not produce any type of results when it comes to extremist violence. I think I will end there, and I'll turn it back over to Nick. And I'm happy to continue the discussion in the Q&A, and I welcome your thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much. I think you've really given us a great overview of the concept and then explaining it, how it works on the ground. Listening to your presentation, I was struck by, if this had been a frame, an intellectual and analytic frame that we had in place, we might have understood better some of the dynamics of the rise and durability of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, whereas so much of the narrative was, well, this is just this is just a movement, and it's religiously motivated people with weapons, and instead, as you said, incentive structures where then people came in and with skills and backgrounds. And in essence, it's like, as you said, it's, if I work for the government or I can work for a private entity, and, ISIS was just another entity for whom, people would work and particularly engaging in some of its business activities and the like. So I think that this is an important corrective, I think, to a mindset where we create this box called violent extremist organization, and we kind of put it to the side and then say, well, we're just going to find a way to eradicate this problem without impacting or thinking about the larger society, the larger societal dynamics, the incentive structures, and that may be why we've had, why some of the efforts that were so heralded, at least at the beginning of the 9/11 period, have not planned out. Just starting to kick this discussion off. And getting things in play from this. I wanted then to maybe get you and based on some of the feedback to kind of get a little bit more at the idea of getting at the incentive structures, because I think that even as you this concept, even as you've named it, you know, the enterprising extremist, the entrepreneurial side of individuals and organizations. I mean, how do you see then getting at the incentive structures, both in a positive way and in a negative way? That to say, look, we can, if you're incentivized, or if people are incentivized to do something that takes them in support of an extremist movement, what are some of the disincentives that can be put forward? And if you can, and just as a connecting to that, how does this fit in with these, you know, these vaunted, heralded, you know, de-extremization programs that we've seen in various parts of the world, where people are kind of put in, and you know, they graduate and now they're no longer considered to be extremists. You know, how does that play, you know, within the framework of the enterprising extremist, if we're taking that as our frame of reference?
Right.
And again, just inviting other people, again, as always, to put questions into the Q&A box that is at the in the panel at the bottom of your screen. Click on Q&A and you can put additional questions there. So.
Sure, Nick. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so, you know, I don't have anything really to add to these de-radicalization programs. They may work, they may not. That's not the group of actors that that are in question, right? They're not the potential enterprising extremists. I think those type of programs are targeted to kind of the rank and file members who, you know, to use a colloquial term, who maybe already drank the Kool-Aid, and it's, you know, how do you get them to rethink and reshape? And they may work, they may not work, and I think, you know, that's a different research project. What I'm looking at is these actors, these violent entrepreneurs who make these rational, calculated choices, right? They haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. They're motivated by this desire for profit and this desire for influence. And, you know, they will, because of that, will engage in whatever form of violence is most conducive to achieving those goals. I think to your question is, how do we figure out, you know, ways to influence those incentive structures? I think one way to do that, a research kind of data-driven way to do that, is to look at those times. You know, I'll take the case of Pakistan, but it can be done anywhere. Look at those times where perhaps one city, there was a rise in extremist violence, but in another city, there was a lull, there was a drop, right? So this happened in Karachi. There was a drop in extremist violence, there was a drop in crime. So what were the conditions at that point that caused that drop? I think that's a way to look at it. And in Karachi, what, you know, I'm thinking of, I forget the years now, probably about 2014, there was a school attack, a big army public school in Peshawar. There was an attack, and after that, it seemed like there was a huge public uproar, this big cry from, you know, rightly so, from the citizens of Pakistan, and it seemed like the government really, local, provincial, federal government, kind of got serious about separating out, you know, actually going after these types of people, right? Before then, there was this kind of wishy-washy, good extremist, bad extremist type framework that was being used, that certain types of extremism, some types of extremists are okay because they work with the state. They can serve a larger purpose, perhaps for different strategic reasons. You know, this is coming back to what I said about a military security frame of reference that sets a lot of policies in Pakistan, right? So there was this wishy-washy, good extremist, bad extremist type thing, which the army public school attack kind of did away with in many respects. It might be coming back now, but at that point in time, it did away with it. And you saw rangers, police forces, paramilitary forces going after not just extremists, which kind of proves some of the points I was making, but going after criminal gangs, going after, you know, streets of Karachi became relatively much safer from things like phone snatching or car theft, and even those kind of things were impacted. So what I'm trying to say here is one way, clearly, and is probably the most intuitive way to impact or influence these incentives, is the state signaling to these actors that it is no longer endorsing any form of violence. It needs to be a credible signal. It needs to go after these groups, right? And kind of say, okay, this type of violence is not allowed. And it produces results. Clearly, the Pakistani state has the capacity to do this. The other thing I would say, you know, what makes me a little nervous, which keeps me up at night these days, is what's happening in Afghanistan, right? We're not thinking through the incentive structures being created right now. As we pull out, there needs to be serious thought about, okay, so the United States was providing X, Y, Z services to these populations. We're going to step back. Are we going to continue to provide those services? If not, is the Afghanistan as a state able to do so? If not, who will? Who will be providing these services, right? And so this is what I mean by thinking through incentive structures. Are we then, with creating an incentive structure where service provision is going to now rest on the most effective actor, which may be an extremist actor, right? And if that's the case, then maybe the way to influence those incentives is to provide those services or find a way to support the Afghan government to provide those services, right? So those are just some of the types of ways, but I think that, you know, getting at it is to study those points in times where actually extremist violence was reduced, while in other places within the same country, they were heightened, and then figure out why, figure out how that happened.
So let me get you to some of the more questions that have come in from Linda Specht. Having served on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq and having focused in other jobs on counterterrorism in Syria and Pakistan, I thought I observed that extremist groups were gradually shifting to criminal activity. Your argument sheds a different light on this phenomenon. Is your argument that this shift from violent entrepreneurs to enterprising extremists and back again is the best way to explain incidents of violent extremism? Or is this a newer phenomenon, meaning that religious extremism hasn't ever been the predominant motive? And then a connected question to that from Sarah Bano. How to change incentive structure for the Pakistani army, which has deep-rooted institutional interests to keep using extremism. So I'll throw those over to you.
Sure. I'm not sure, Linda, if this is a new phenomenon or not. I mean, at least from 1988 onwards, where my research begins, it exists, this phenomenon exists. I'm also not saying that when there's an extremist actor, they will stop engaging in other forms of activity. What I'm saying is that often we look at the actor, right? And we say, okay, this person, to put it very kind of basely, this person looks like an extremist, right? It has the garbs of extremism, whatever whatever kind of normative views we use of that. Or they espouse or are using the narrative of violence, right? And because that person is, looks like a Taliban, says he's a Taliban, and says that all, Western culture is wrong, all the narratives that we're very familiar with of extremism. So whatever that person then does is then termed extremism. What I'm arguing is not an actor-based definition of extremist violence. I think extremist violence has to do with the act itself, right? So if somebody who looks like that is then, holding someone up and grabbing their phone, I don't think that's an incident of extremist violence, right? That is still criminal activity in my mind, in my definition in the research. So I think it's important to recognize what we mean by extremist violence. And again, I'm using extremism and extremist violence very interchangeably here. And I think there's a distinction. I look at specific incidents of extremist violence, not extremism, because I'm not really even sure how to measure extremism. So looking at incidents of violence. So, I don't know if I'm getting, precisely at your question, Linda, but I would say that these actors, because they're so fungible, go back and forth. They sometimes simultaneously engage in different types of violence, right? Sometimes they're engaging in electoral political violence. And at the same time, we'll host another kind of riot or rally that is it becomes violent and uses those narratives of extremist violence. So I define it as kind of a particular style of violence more than anything else. And I think they go back and forth within these types of different profit-making enterprises. Nick, can you please remind me of the second question? I'm sorry, I should have written it down. Oh, you're on mute.
Group them together. No, I'm unmuting here. So the question from Sarah Bano is how to change incentive structure for the Pakistani army, which has a deep-rooted institutional interest to keep using extremism. So I guess this is the other end of the other part of the equation, which is entrepreneurial, enterprising extremists, and then those who may be willing to contract them for their services or find it useful. So.
Right. And I think that's a very important question. And I think it's tricky, right? And it's also important not to frame it one way or the other, right? We can say, yes, the Pakistan army has an institutional interest in supporting some of these groups, but clearly at points in time, there have been points in times where it doesn't have that interest and has targeted these groups. Pakistan army has lost, I don't know the number offhand, but a lot of personnel going after these groups. The Rabia Zafar operations, conducting different operations in Karachi and Waziristan. It has targeted extremist groups and extremist entities when the strategic calculation is in its benefit, right? So institutional interests are tricky, they're sticky, it takes a while to change, but I think they can be changed. And some of the things I was suggesting earlier, this outsized role that the Pakistani army has, or the Pakistani military has in policymaking, is definitely due to some local, constraints, institutional constraints, the challenges of civilian government, the ineffectiveness of civilian government at times, but it also has to do with how much, this is kind of a constructivist argument, but how much stock we give, how much the rest of the world community gives to the army, right? So my example about our Secretary of Defense should not be meeting with General Bajwa. That is not his counterpart, right? We should not be discussing policy with military members. So some of that role, some of that influence is kind of imbued from the outside as well. So I think it's tricky. I think you've hit, the problem on the head, where when the government or the military has that organizational or institutional incentive to support these groups, it would be hard to change it. But I think that there are ways where you can change the calculation, whether that's, including the military, including the civilian government in peace settlements in Afghanistan and neighboring countries, kind of changing the strategic calculus. And I think that takes very sophisticated and elegant policy, but I don't think it's impossible to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point that you're raising there. Just again, a reminder, we take questions here through the Q&A box. So if you are interested, not through the chat or through any other means, it's through the Q&A box that we're monitoring. Aitaz Goraya asks, do you think that regional circumstances or politics has any effect on these entrepreneurs, and should the incentives be adjusted as per a regional atmosphere?
Most definitely, I would say it does. So the case of what's happening next door in Afghanistan changes dynamics, whether it's directly by having, for example, that NATO supply chain going, the example that I gave, or having cross-border incentives, right? So one of the reasons why it makes sense to have that, or made sense to have that distinction between good extremists and bad extremists, a lot of that came from regional calculation, kind of an assessment of what was happening. This whole kind of almost now outdated policy that's been discussed a lot about the Pakistani military wanting this strategic depth in Afghanistan. We've heard this to death, and I don't know how relevant it is anymore. But of course, regional dynamics make a huge difference. That being said, I find the local dynamics, which are obviously impacted by the regional dynamics, to be more interesting to study, right? Because the regional dynamics are what they are, but still I find variation subnationally among cities. So Quetta, Karachi, Peshawar, Lahore have different local dynamics that sometimes incentivize extremist violence over other forms of violence. Sometimes they incentivize a different type of violence, and they are not the same. So yes, we work in a regional context, we work in a global context, obviously, but I think focusing on the local incentive structure gives us much more analytical mileage, gives us much more optionality when it comes to policy making.
Yeah, and I think at that point too, that about the question of different types of violence, and that I think is something also to look at, that and how it's cloaked and how it's presented is very important, because is this done in the name of religion? Is that the stated excuse? Is it done to defend an ethnic or an ethnic community or a neighborhood, or is it done to advance control of territory or of economic assets? I'm just struck as I'm listening to this too, as well, is the extent to which, and perhaps if this is a direction you'd like to look at, that we in the United States often apply very different ways of thinking about and dealing with violence when it occurs within a domestic U.S. context versus overseas, and that somehow, and this in a way perhaps goes back to Ayat Zaz's question and expands on it as well, the regional context, but also is that a problem, you think, analytically for us, that we look at if violence is happening on the south side of Chicago versus within a neighborhood in Karachi, is there a way in which we kind of really say, well, those are just so completely different, as opposed to not looking that, well, perhaps these the models that you're putting forward, in fact, also have applicability for violence within the domestic U.S. case, and that it's not just about quote unquote exotic others where this takes place, but can also explain what happens in Chicago or Baltimore or what's happening in Portland right now. I mean, just anywhere is there a domestic applicability if we strip away some of the adjectival labels that we've put on different types of violence around the world?
Yeah, I mean, Nick, that's an excellent point, and that's something that I've been made very acutely aware of since this article has come out. I've had so many people come to me and say, well, I study Ireland, I study domestic politics in the United States, and I see the applicability of this frame, right? So like you said, normatively, or the way we look at extremism, right? Extremism was generally, based in the last 20 years or so, applied to Muslim majority countries, right? That's something that did not exist necessarily, although we have historical cases, but when you say extremism, you think of Muslim majority countries. To your point, I feel that maybe that frame, because of how we think about it, is not applicable, but the enterprising extremist framework is very much applicable, right? So even if we look at domestic politics in the United States, I haven't done much research on this, but it might not be religious, a context, but a political ideology, right, that people say is driving certain types of behavior. I would contend that it's not political ideology. I would contend it's the same type of enterprising extremists, the same type of incentives for affluence and influence that drive divisive politics, that drive kind of the type of violence that we saw on January 6th at the US Capitol. Right. So again, I haven't done any kind of in-depth research into this, or have the data, but intuitively, and based on discussions with people who do study this, I would argue, or I would think that the same type of frame is very much applicable to the domestic case, to other cases of violence all over the world. In India, for example, I mean, it's neighboring to Pakistan, but the rise of this religious nationalism in the BJP movement and how it's taken on a violent turn in many respects, right? I would argue that has more to do with incentives than religion, by and large.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and group together some of the last questions and comments, and then give you a chance to give a final response and overview, if you would like. Tariq Parvez comments, I think the biggest disincentive for the extremist organizations in Pakistan is that there should be the strong political will of the state to take them on. The problem is these organizations have got a political vote in every constituency. They have street power in the madrasa students, and above all, the slogan of religion is a great popular appeal, and this complicates the efforts of the government to take them out. And again, any thoughts that you might have on this multidimensional challenge, and then a follow-on question, or grouping these two together, the impact of terrorism in Pakistan over Kashmir, but also over the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And then to kind of close it out, a follow-on from Linda Specht about incentive structures and what happens as our military mission in Afghanistan winds down, that there's been this, as you said, a steady flow of goods coming in from Karachi into Afghanistan. This is going to end. What's that going to do for incentive structures? So any last thoughts on that? And then give us your final takeaway.
Sure. Yeah. The question from Tariq Parvez, I mean, I think that is definitely an issue, this lack of political will, because of the street power that you named from these extremist groups. But that being said, like I said before, there are certain times in Pakistan's recent history where that political will existed, right? So I would argue, as an academic, that we studied those points in time. Where did that political will come from? How do we, how can we influence that? How can that political will be sustained? And that's, the street power argument. Yes, I think I agree with you that, of course, these groups have these extremist groups have that power. But the actors that I'm talking about are not necessarily even the leaders of these groups, right? They are sometimes just criminal gangs or kind of mafia bosses then turn to extremist violence, and then there's that incentive structure. So your question gets at the heart of the research in many ways. And what I'm suggesting is that the incentives, or the political will, as you termed it, can be influenced. When they're the right incentives, I think they will change course. I think Linda's question about Afghanistan, and I think we have a case. We've done this before. We just have to look back into history, and we can see what happened to Peshawar. We can see what happened in Afghanistan once, at when the Soviets were moved and the United States kind of lost interest in the region. We have that as a case study. There was a influx of the drug trade. There was in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, for sure, small arms trade. So there were all these kind of funding streams, or all these kind of markets that developed around that. And so I think we have the perfect case study to kind of avoid making the mistake the second time around, the same mistakes the second time around. And then I'm not sure I understood the second question too much about CPEC. That's, I think it's getting at that issue of looking at regional incentives a little bit. And again, we've seen this, China's projects in many parts of the world, they do influence local incentives for a lot of things, right? And that's something I haven't studied in depth in Pakistan, but is definitely a place for further research. What types of incentives is it creating? What does it do to local markets of violence? Clearly in some places it increased incentives for the state to actually push back against some of these more violent actors, criminal actors, because the Pakistani government wants to provide a safe space for Chinese engineers to build ports and such, right? And we've seen this in other places. So it can actually have a more of a positive effect, is what I'd like to end with.
That's wonderful, and that actually perfectly right on the clock at 1 o'clock, which is when we like to end our our presentations so that we don't take up too much of your time. But this has been a great conversation. Rabia, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Certainly thank you for the article in Orbis. I hope it continues to gain attention to the research and work that you are doing. With that, I don't know if I can then turn it back to Raleigh to conclude our meeting for this day.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Rabia. That was fascinating and certainly an important topic as the Biden administration redefines its role in these various regions. I would also like to again remind our audience of tomorrow's event, 10 a.m. with Dr. Chris Miller, FPRI's director of its Eurasia program. He will be hosting an expert panel talking about the 3 Cs initiative and the 12 countries who have interests in the 3 Cs, the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Sea in that region. So please join us 10 a.m. tomorrow, and thank you again, and support us. Thank you.